Thank you very much. My name is Patrick Henriksson. I am affiliated with Stockholm Resilience Center as part of Stockholm University, the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics, and WorldFish, that's based in Malaysia. And I'm going to talk a bit today about interventions in aquaculture to promote food security. And this is related to a paper we published last year in One Earth, and you see the title there in its fullness and all the co-authors that helped me pull this through. So let's start. Yeah, aquaculture, we know it's a very diverse sector. We produce over 300 species in freshwater and marine environments, and we produce them in many different ways. So there's many different farming systems for each species as well. And this is, of course, part of the charm of aquaculture. There is a very diverse sector, but it also faces us with certain challenges when it comes to optimizing production systems. So this research kind of set off in trying to find interventions for how we could improve aquaculture without increasing its environmental footprint. And so, first of all, if we kind of map these species, here we see a graph from the paper where we on the x-axis have the global production volumes per species, and on the y-axis we have the average price per species. The dotted lines is the weighted averages for all species, and by doing this we basically get 4 quadrants. So the dominating aquaculture systems are the bottom right quadrant. That is where we have a lot of our omnivorous finfish species, the carps. We also have the filter feeding finfish species such as bighead carp and silver carp, also mussels. So these are our species that are produced in high volumes and are relatively affordable. So they're attractive and they make large contributions to food security and nutrition globally. The top right one is species that we consume more in the Western world, such as trout, salmon, shrimp, and these are also produced in large volumes, but come at a higher price, so they're not available to all. And then we also have a large number of what we call niche species. Those are produced more regionally and at lower volumes, and they can be both accessible, so cheap, or they can be luxury species. So in the extreme cases here, we find things like bluefin tuna or halibut farming. So I want to show this for you to keep this in mind, that bottom right quadrant, that's really the species that are produced in a large quantities and are really important for food security. And related to this work, just to give you some background, this is another paper we wrote last year, and where we try and benchmark the environmental performance of blue foods. And in this paper, we quantified the environmental footprint of a number of different species, and we compare that to poultry. So the gray line you see in the middle of each of these graphs, that's our comparison, so poultry production. And what we see here in the top left graph, that's called A, is that these filter feeding finfish species, so silver and bighead carp and bivalves and seaweeds, they come with the lowest environmental footprints. And similarly for the top graph in the middle graph in the top row and the right graph in the top row, that's nitrogen and phosphorus emissions per ton produced. We see that they're very efficient at producing blue foods with a little environmental impact. On the other hand, we have a middle cluster with a lot of omnivorous species and also trout and salmon. Salmon and trout are a bit different because we put a lot of effort into weaning them off carnivorous diets. So we feed them with more vegetables today than they do eat in the nature. But they also perform relatively well against poultry. And the big outliers, the big emitters, are the miscellaneous diadromus and marine fish species. These are often carnivorous species that we farm in the oceans. And as a reference in the bottom left here, we see species from capture fisheries. I'm not going to mention much of that today. And bottom right and middle is the freshwater use and land use for these different species. Again, the marine filter feeding species are performing very well. The bivalves have an advantage in many of these for animals, and of course seaweeds can also be produced with very low environmental impacts. But the real focus today was then to say, how could we use these benchmarks and focus on interventions to lower them even further? So increase production without increasing our resource use. So we identified in this paper 9 different areas for aquaculture interventions. These include things like the species we produce, the feeds we feed them with, the genetics of those species, farm technologies and practices, spatial planning and access, trade, financial tools, and post-harvest and distribution, as well as disease reduction. So I'm going to go through these and summarize kind of what our conclusions were. And if you want to read the big figure, the left one here, and it's in detail, I'm not going to go through it now, but feel free to download it with our paper. So we start with species. This is, of course, a very pivotal choice in terms of if you want to lower your environmental impacts and make products cheaper and more available, the type of species you choose govern a lot of the requirements you need for your farming. So as mentioned, carnivorous species, they are usually more reliant on higher quality feed resources, such as fish meal, fish oil, but even the vegetables they eat are often of higher quality, so soybeans. And we also have a big variability amongst the edible yield among different species. And that's, of course, also influenced by the culture that consumes them. But that's of importance. There's also a big variability in the tolerance to disease and oxygen levels and water quality amongst different species. So what we're trying to find here is a species that have very low requirements, but is still very tolerant. But then again, we also need people to buy these species and be attracted to them. And that has its own challenges, such as bones in fish. People are not very keen on that. And bivalves seem to have a limited acceptance globally. People like to eat mussels, but only in limited quantities. And algae, of course, we only eat in very, very small quantities worldwide. So to display kind of the differences here on the right, it's a figure from another paper where they're looking at the requirement of fish meal for different farming systems and how much we will produce in the future. And you see there's large variability. So we often come back to these fed finfish and crustacean species. That's what people seem to like and that they're willing to consume in larger quantities. And for a lot of these farming systems where feeds are used, they often account for over 90% of the environmental impacts. So it's very, very important to have the right feed if you want to do sustainable aquaculture. A lot of the feed research is also related to things like deforestation, such as soybeans from Brazil, and where we also have to be careful so we don't shift our environmental burden from the aquaculture pond to the Brazilian rainforest. There's also many resources that compete with food availability, such as maize and wheat that we could also readily consume, same with soybeans and fish meal to some extent. But there are many novel ingredients that are coming, but volumes are still kind of low. We don't produce them in any significant quantities, and the prices remain high. This might change, but some big contenders we see is fish meal from fisheries and aquaculture byproducts. This is probably the most established kind of source of alternative feed ingredients. And we also have insect meals, and I think there will be a talk about this later. And also a number of different microbial biomass systems that seem to be pretty well tended for aquaculture. Other things that have been proposed, like macroalgae and food waste, they are generally of lesser nutritional value, so they're not so optimized as an alternative feed for aquaculture. Thirdly, we have the type of farming system that we farm our species in. Of course, we have a great divide between marine and freshwater species, but for most freshwater and brackish water species, we see that pond aquaculture is the dominating farming system worldwide. And this has a disadvantage in that it requires land, of course. And depending on how these ponds, they often are aggregated in areas, they tend to lead to the spread of disease fairly easily. And so in terms of a very common system in oceans is the net pens. So for example, salmon farming, where you have a picture in the middle on the right, that is a typical salmon farm from Norway. But that could also be tropical cage systems or cages in lakes or in rivers. So for these systems, you get a lot of the ecosystem services for free through water exchange. But this also results in the release of nutrients, of course, to the surrounding environment, which is a disadvantage. And there's also a risk of spread of disease and that the actual fish escapes to the wild and resulting in genetic pollution. So because of these concerns, there's been a push lately towards moving farming up on land, so-called recirculating aquaculture systems. So in theory, these are great because you don't risk escapees, you can have high biosecurity, and you can recycle your water. But of course, they're very expensive to build and operate, and they're very energy intensive, which in today's Europe, that can be a big challenge given the energy prices. So for example, in Sweden, from where I am, we have on the bottom right picture here is a proposed land-based salmon farm that they're building in Sweden right now. And even if they got the money to build it, we'll see how easily, like if they will be able to turn it into a profit or not, given the higher energy prices. And lastly, I'm just going to mention that offshore aquaculture is another topic that's been discussed, but again, it's very expensive. And it tends to focus, both ROS and offshore tends to focus on these higher value species. So this luxury species that I talked about earlier, which of course might not really help alleviate food security globally, but they might just put a higher diversity on the already nourished global north on their plates. So next, I will talk a little bit about spatial planning, access, and disease reduction. These are related in terms of that your spatial planning can really influence how disease spread. Of course, you have the direct consequences when you come to spatial planning of land use and land use change. For example, mangrove deforestation in Asia and from shrimp farming, we know is a big issue. But you also have issues like carrying capacities. So the picture here on the bottom right is from a lake in Indonesia, where you see all the tilapia farms in Lake Serata, which have actually led to the collapse of the ecosystems, which resulted in mass mortality amongst these farms. So there's an importance here that you have a good spatial planning, so you don't exceed the carrying capacity of these ecosystems where you farm in. And then, of course, it's about access to optimal farming locations. So if you have a farm in an area where the conditions are not optimal, you have a higher likelihood to get disease, and your fish will grow less, will grow slower. You can also do by planning well and how you farm. You can also limit the spread of disease. So if there's an outbreak, you can buffer for that. And finally, it will allow for you to have biosecurity. And in the bottom left here is just a graph from Mowi is the largest salmon producer in Norway. They're antimicrobial use, and I just wanted to show here that Chile is as an example, because they have the problem with the rickettsia, the SRS disease, and that they are by far the largest users of antibiotics, which tells you again that Chile might not be the most optimal place to farm salmon. In terms of genetic improvements, globally, about only 10% of all aquaculture is produced with selective breeding programs. If you compare that to terrestrial livestock, that's a very small amount, where terrestrial livestock is almost everything has been genetically improved. So there's large improvements for yield, like for fillet yields, but also increased disease resistance. You can also select for growth rate or appearance if that's your trait. However, it's good to keep in mind here, it's always hard when you do this genetic. If you select for a trait, it's hard to select for more than one trait. So with WorldFish, we are doing a lot of genetic improvements, and this is a challenge we see. And there's always, of course, also the trade-off between species diversity. So I mentioned that we're farming over 300 species. So if you need a genetic improvement program for all of those species, that's very hard than if you have a few. So there's always this trade-off, which is interesting. In terms of post-harvest processing and distribution, this is also a very, very important field if you want to improve the performance and reduce your environmental impacts of aquatic foods. And partially that you can use value addition to increase acceptance for many species that we might not consume today. You can also increase the edible yield, and you can make seafood more accessible to consumers, because a lot of consumers are not comfortable with cooking seafood at home. You might also improve expiry dates, which is very important because now globally FAO has estimated about 35% of all seafood globally is not consumed. And in the US, this number has been estimated as high as half of all seafood is wasted as food loss or waste before it reaches consumers. So on the right is just two pictures of novel products. The top right one is pickled roach from Finland, which is a species they don't usually eat, but this was a way to people to consume the species. And the bottom right is for a goby, that's an invasive species in the Baltic, where there was an art project and they made sushi out of it, just out of novelty. And in terms of trade and financial tools, we see that trade is, of course, regulated in different ways. So certification standards is one way, but that only covers a very small portion of global aquaculture and a handful of species. So it doesn't really have any larger impact on global sustainability. Also, we have the issue of traceability, where we know that about a third of all traded seafood is mislabeled as a different species. But a lot is happening in this field in terms of blockchain technology of following fish from wherever it's farmed to the fish counter, and DNA barcoding, where you can actually tell which species it is. Also, in terms of financial tools, the smallholder farmers might not always have access to the improved seeds, feeds, and diagnostics. But we therefore need good insurance for these farmers. That is really not an option today in many places, and also cooperatives. And lastly, regulations is the big field where you can really regulate a lot of these interventions. But it's very important that you do draft your regulations well and that you enforce them. So to conclude, I think we can say that blue foods have a variable environmental footprints, but generally perform well compared to terrestrial animal production. However, most systems still suffer from a performance gap. Secondly, freshwater finfish aquaculture is the largest and will probably continue to dominate global aquaculture production, but it's gained little from the interventions I've mentioned today. So I think if you want to reach a large volume of production, that's where you could really apply these interventions. And lastly, that if you focus on a few species, it might result in larger advancements in the short terms, but in the long term, you would erode that diversity that we love with aquaculture, and therefore also its resilience in the long term. So thank you. Here's some additional material that one might want to consider if you thought this was interesting. So I will leave it open for questions from here.
Thank you very much. Is there any question?
Also from the chat, you can write it down and we will read it in the room. So I think it seems to be too clear. And we have no question, and really thank you for your presentation. And I'm so sorry I did not okay, we have a question. We have one in the chat. I'm so sorry I cannot read your name. Angel Daniel Avadi Tapia is asking, is there a specific set of strategies aimed at small producer from developing countries?
I think that the only thing I can say is that you have there's so many different aspects to this, and I mean when you saw this larger map we did of all the interventions, it ranged from the high-end technological solutions to the very, very simple ones like record keeping. So I think each region and each species has its different potentials, but rarely is there one silver bullet, but it's a mix of them.
So, thank you. And we have another one. Max Troll said, is LCA sufficient for assessing sustainability of aquaculture?
Yeah, thanks, Max. And as you know, in the paper we co-authored, there's many aspects that are not captured by LCA indicators, and we do dwell in this in this environmental impact paper that I presented today. So there are, of course, things like invasive species, the use of raw materials that might be of food quality, and many other aspects that we don't capture in the LCA indicators that are very, very important to consider, that go beyond the ones that you maybe traditionally think of when you talk about terrestrial animal production. So yes, there are many.
And actually, we have one more. I'm so sorry. I may be wrong in pronouncing this name. Razjan asked, novel feedstuffs such as insects have large footprint in LCA. How to overcome that?
So I mean, you always have the economy of scales, and I think that with time prices will come down, most surely. But whether it will compete with fish meal is always hard to say. Fish meal is an extremely efficient machinery, and of course, is a free resource. You don't have to farm the fish; you just catch them and process them. So whether it will ever compete without including externalities, I doubt it. But I'm sure prices will come down in the coming years.
So thank you again for your presentation and for your answers. I'm so sorry I did not introduce myself at the very beginning.